Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a full auditorium in a country that's so far away from mine. Before I start, I want to tell you that I'm going to test your patience because America has a reputation for having a short attention span. So I thought, let me check this out. It's truly an honor to be delivering the Eqbal Ahmad Distinguished Lecture. In the last 2 days that I've been here, I think that the most important thing about him is not that he was respected or honored, but that he was so loved. And that seems like such a rare thing today. And to be doing a lecture in the name of a man that was obviously so deeply loved is a wonderful thing. I thought that since I'm a writer, you'd be more interested in the way I write rather than in the way I speak. So I wrote this lecture, and I'm going to read it to you. It was very difficult for me to know where to pitch it, to know how much, who knew about India. So I just decided to forget about you and just write it the way I wanted to. I hope that it's not going to be confusing for you. I hope that I'm not dealing with issues that you know nothing about too quickly. But anyway, if you get bored, just heckle me and I'll shut up. The lecture is, I know that it's been publicized as being called a writer's place in politics, but since I don't plan my life in advance, I changed the title. And it's called The Ladies Have Feelings, so shall we leave it to the experts? So here's how it starts. India lives in several centuries at the same time. Somehow we manage to progress and regress simultaneously. As a nation, we age by pushing outwards from the middle, adding a few centuries onto either end of our extraordinary CV. We greaten like the maturing head of a hammer-headed shark, with eyes looking in diametrically opposite directions. I have no doubt that even here in North America, you've heard that Germany is considering changing its immigration laws in order to import Indian software engineers. I have even less doubt that you've heard of the Naga Sadhu at the Kumbh Mela, who towed the district commissioner's car with his penis, while the commissioner sat in it solemnly with his wife and children. As Indian citizens, we subsist on a regular diet of caste massacres and nuclear tests, mosque breakings and fashion shows, church burnings and expanding cell phone networks, bonded labor and the digital revolution, female feticide and the NASDAQ crash, husbands who continue to burn their wives for dowry, and our delectable stockpile of Miss Worlds. I don't mean to put a simplistic value judgment on this peculiar form of progress by suggesting that modern is good and traditional is bad, or vice versa. But what's hard to reconcile oneself to, both personally and politically, is the schizophrenic nature of it. And that applies not just to the ancient modern conundrum, but to the utter illogic of what appears to be the current national enterprise. In the lane behind my house in Delhi, every night I walk past road gangs of emaciated laborers digging a trench to lay fiber optic cables to speed up our digital revolution. In the bitter winter cold, they work by the light of a few candles. It's as though the people of India have been rounded up and loaded onto 2 convoys of trucks, a huge big one and a tiny little one that have set off in resolutely opposite directions. The tiny convoy is on its way to a glittering destination somewhere at the top of the world. The other convoy just melts into the darkness and disappears. A cursory survey that tallies the caste, class, and religion of who gets to be on which convoy would make a good, lazy person's concise guide to the history of India. For some of us, life in India is like being suspended between two of the trucks, one in each convoy, and they move apart, being neatly dismembered, not bodily, but emotionally and intellectually. Of course, India is a microcosm of the world. Of course, versions of what happened there happens everywhere. Of course, if you're willing to look, the parallels are easy to find. The difference in India is only in the scale, the magnitude, and the sheer proximity of the disparity. In India, your face is slammed right up against it. To address it, to deal with it, to not deal with it, to try and understand it, to insist on not understanding it, to simply survive it on a daily, hourly basis is a fine art in itself. Either an art or a form of insular, inward-looking insanity, or both. To be a writer, a supposedly famous writer, in a country where 400 million people are illiterate is a dubious honor. To be a writer in a country that gave the world Mahatma Gandhi, that invented the concept of nonviolent resistance, and then half a century later followed that up with nuclear tests, is a ferocious burden. Though no more ferocious a burden, it has to be said, than being a writer in a country that has enough nuclear weapons to destroy the earth several times over, like yours. To be a writer in a country where something akin to an undeclared civil war is being waged upon its subjects in the name of development is an onerous responsibility. When it comes to writers and writing, I use words like onerous and responsibility with a heavy heart and not a small degree of sadness. This is what I'm here to talk to you about, to think aloud with you about. What is the role of writers and artists in society? Do they have a definable role? Can it be fixed, described, characterized in any definite way? Should it be? Personally, I can think of few things more terrifying than if writers and artists were charged with an immutable charter of duties and responsibilities that they had to live and work by. Imagine if there was this little black book, a sort of approved guide to good writing, that said all writers shall be politically conscious and sexually moral, or all writers should believe in God, globalization, and the joys of family life. Rule 1 for a writer, as far as I'm concerned, is there are no rules. Rule 2, since Rule 1 was made to be broken, is there are no excuses for bad art. Painters, writers, singers, actors, dancers, filmmakers, they are meant to fly, to push at the frontiers, to worry the edges of the human imagination, to conjure beauty from the most unexpected things, to find magic in places where others never thought to look. If you limit the trajectory of their flight, if you weight their wings with society's existing notions of morality and responsibility, if you trust them up with preconceived values, you sabotage their endeavor. A good or great writer may refuse to accept any responsibility or morality that the society he or she lives in wishes to impose on them. And yet, the best and greatest of them know that if they abuse this hard-won freedom, it will only lead to bad art. There's an intricate web of morality, rigor, and responsibility that writing itself imposes upon a writer. It's singular, it's individual, but nevertheless, it's there. At its best, it's an exquisite bond between the artist and the medium. At its acceptable end, a sort of sensible cooperation. At its worst, it's a relationship of disrespect and exploitation. But the absence of external rules complicates things. There's a very thin line that separates the strong, true, bright bird of the imagination from the synthetic, noisy bauble. Where is that line? How do you recognize it? How do you know you've crossed it? At the risk of sounding esoteric and arcane, I'm tempted to say, you just know. The fact is that nobody, no reader, no reviewer, agent, publisher, colleague, friend, or enemy can tell you for sure. A writer just has to ask herself that question and answer it as honestly as possible. The thing about this line is that once you learn to recognize it, once you see it, it's impossible to ignore. You have no choice but to live with it, to follow it through. You have to bear with all its complexities, contradictions, and demands, and that's not always easy. It can lead you to the strangest, wildest places. It doesn't always lead to compliments and standing emotions. In the midst of a bloody military coup, for instance, you could find yourself fascinated by the mating rituals of a purple sunbird, or the secret life of captive goldfish, or an old aunt's descent into madness. Or, on the contrary, like me, you could, in the midst of putative peace, be unfortunate enough to stumble on a silent war. The trouble is that once you see the line, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. Today, perhaps more so than in any other era in history, the writer's right to free speech is guarded and defended by the civil societies and state establishments of the most powerful countries in the world. Any overt attempt to silence or muffle a voice is met with furious opposition. The writer is embraced and protected. This is a wonderful thing. The writer, the actor, the musician, the filmmaker, they've become the radiant jewels in the crown of modern civilization. I imagine that the artist is finally as free as he or she ever will be. Never before have so many writers had their books published, and now, of course, we have the internet. Never before have we been more commercially viable. We live and prosper in the heart of the marketplace. True, for every so-called success, there are hundreds who fail. True, there are a myriad art forms, both folk and classical, myriad languages, myriad cultural and artistic traditions that are being crushed and cast aside in the stampede to the big bumper sale in Wonderland. But still, there have never been more writers, more singers, more actors, more painters who have become influential, wealthy superstars. And they, the successful ones, spawn a million imitators. They become the torchbearers. Their work becomes the benchmark for what art is or ought to be. Nowadays in India, the scene is almost farcical. Following the commercial success of some Indian authors, Western publishers are desperately prospecting for the next big Indo-Anglian thing. They're doing everything short of interviewing English-speaking Indians for the post of writer. This is true, you know. Ambitious middle-class parents who a few years ago would only settle for a future in engineering, medicine, or management for their children now hopefully send them to creative writing schools. People like myself are constantly petitioned by computer companies, watch manufacturers, even media magnates to endorse their products. A boutique owner in Bombay asked me if he could display my book as though it was an accessory, a bracelet, or a pair of earrings, while he filmed me shopping for clothes. Jhumpa Lahiri, the American writer of Indian origin who won the Pulitzer Prize, came to India to have a traditional Bengali wedding. The wedding was reported on the front page of the national newspapers. Now, where does all this lead us? Is it just harmless nonsense that's best ignored? How does all this ardent wooing affect our art? What kind of lenses does it put in our spectacles? How far does it remove us from the world around us? There is very real danger that this neoteric seduction can shut us up far more effectively than violence and repression ever could. We have free speech, maybe, but do we have really free speech? If what we have to say doesn't sell, will we still say it? Can we? Or is everybody looking for things that sell to say? Could writers end up playing the role of palace entertainers, or the subtle 21st century version of court eunuchs attending to the pleasures of our incumbent CEOs? You know, naughty but nice, risque perhaps, but not risky. It's been nearly 4 years now since my first and so far only novel, The God of Small Things, was published. In the early days, I used to be described, introduced, as the author of an almost freakishly successful, if I may use so vulgar a term, first book. Nowadays, I'm introduced as something of a freak myself. I am apparently what is known in 21st century vernacular as a writer activist, like a sofa bed. Why am I called a writer activist? And why, even when it's used approvingly and admiringly, does that term make me flinch? I'm called a writer activist because after writing The God of Small Things, I wrote 3 political essays: The End of Imagination about India's nuclear tests, The Greater Common Good about big dams and the development debate, and Power Politics, the reincarnation of Rumpelstiltskin, about the privatization and corporatization of essential infrastructure like water and electricity. Apart from building the temple, the Hindu temple in Ayodhya, where a mosque once stood, these are currently the top priorities of the Indian government. Now, I've been wondering why it should be that the person who wrote The God of Small Things is called a writer, and the person who wrote the political essays is called an activist. True, The God of Small Things is a work of fiction, but it's no less political than any of the essays. And true, the essays are works of non-fiction, but since when did writers forego the right to write non-fiction? My thesis, my humble theory, as we say in India, is that I've been saddled with this double-barreled appellation, this awful professional label, not because my work is political, but because in my essays, which are about very contentious issues, I take sides. I take a position, I have a point of view. What's worse, I make it clear that I think that it's right and moral to take that position. And what's even worse, I use everything in my power to flagrantly support and solicit support for that position. Now, for a writer of the 21st century, that's considered a pretty uncool, unsophisticated thing to do. It skates uncomfortably close to the territory occupied by political party ideologues, a breed of people that the world has learned, quite rightly, to mistrust. I'm aware of this. I'm all for being circumspect. I'm all for discretion, prudence, tentativeness, subtlety, ambiguity, complexity. I love the unanswered question, the unresolved story, the unclimbed mountain, the tender shard of an incomplete dream, most of the time. But is it mandatory for a writer to be ambiguous about everything? Is it not true that there have been fearful episodes in human history when prudence and discretion would have just been euphemisms for pusillanimity, when caution was actually cowardice, when sophistication was disguised decadence, when circumspection was really a kind of espousal? Isn't it true, or at least theoretically possible, that there are times in the life of a people or a nation when the political climate demands that we, even the most sophisticated of us, take sides? I believe that such times are upon us, and I believe that in the coming years, intellectuals and artists in India will be called upon to take sides, in the world actually. And this time, unlike during the struggle for independence, we won't have the luxury of fighting an enemy. We'll be fighting ourselves. We'll be forced to ask ourselves some very uncomfortable questions about our values and traditions, our vision for the future, our responsibilities as citizens, the legitimacy of our democratic institutions, the role of the state, the police, the army, and, very crucially, the intellectual community. 50 years after independence, India is still struggling with the legacy of colonialism, still flinching from the cultural insult. As citizens, we're still caught up in the business of disproving the white world's definition of us. Intellectually and emotionally, we've just begun to grapple with communal and caste politics that threaten to tear our society apart. But in the meantime, something new looms on our horizon, something that's almost too colossal for human comprehension to contain, to even try and understand it, to hold the whole of it in your imagination, is to situate yourself at the edge of sanity, to offer yourself up for ridicule. It's not war, it's not genocide, it's not ethnic cleansing, it's not a famine or an epidemic. On the face of it, it's just business. It lacks the drama, the biblical magnificence of war or genocide or famine. It's dull in comparison. It makes bad TV. It has to do with boring things like jobs, money, water supply, electricity, irrigation. But it also has to do with the process of barbaric dispossession on a scale that has few parallels in history. You may have guessed by now that I'm talking about the modern version of globalization. What is globalization? Who is it for? What is it going to do to a country like India, in which social inequality has been institutionalized by the caste system for centuries? A country in which 700 million people live in rural areas, in which 80% of the land holdings are small farms, in which 400 million people are illiterate. Is the corporatization and globalization of agriculture, water supply, electricity, and essential commodities going to pull India out of the stagnant morass of poverty, illiteracy, and religious bigotry? Is the dismantling and auctioning off of elaborate public sector infrastructure that has been developed with public money over the last 50 years really the way forward? Is globalization going to close the gap between the privileged and the underprivileged, between the upper castes and the lower castes, between the educated and the illiterate? Or is it going to give those who already have a centuries-old head start a friendly helping hand? Is globalization about the eradication of poverty, or is it a mutant version of colonialism, remote-controlled and digitally operated? These are huge, contentious questions. The answers vary depending on whether they come from the villages and fields of rural India, from the slums and shanty towns of urban India, from the living rooms of the burgeoning middle class, or from the boardrooms of big business houses. Today, India produces more milk, more sugar, more food grain than ever before. This year, government warehouses are overflowing with 42 million tons of food grain. That's almost a quarter of the total annual food grain produce. Farmers with too much grain on their hands were driven to despair. In regions that wielded enough political clout, the government went on a distress buying spree, buying more grain than it could possibly store or use. While the grain rots in government warehouses, 350 million Indian citizens live below the poverty line without even a single meal a day. And yet, last March, just before President Clinton's visit to India, the Indian government lifted import restrictions on 1,400 commodities, including milk, grain, sugar, cotton, tea, coffee, rubber, and palm oil. This despite the fact that there was a glut of these products on the market. From the 1st of April, April Fool's Day this year, according to the terms of its agreement with the WTO, the Indian government will have to drop its quantitative import restrictions. The Indian market is already flooded with cheaper imports. Though India is technically free to export its agricultural produce, in practice, most of it cannot be exported because it doesn't meet the first world's environmental standards. You don't eat bruised mangoes or bananas with the mosquito bites or rice with a few weevils in it, whereas we don't mind the odd mosquito or the occasional weevil. Developed countries like the US, whose hugely subsidized farm industry engages only 2 to 3% of its total population, are using the WTO to pressurize countries like India to drop agricultural subsidies in order to make the market competitive. Huge mechanized corporate enterprises working thousands of acres of farmland want to compete with impoverished subsistence farmers who own a couple of hectares of land. In effect, India's rural economy, which supports 700 million people, is being garroted. Farmers who produce too much are in distress. Farmers who produce too little are in distress. Landless agricultural labor is out of work as big estates and farms lay off their workers. And they're all flocking to the cities in search of employment. Trade, not aid, is the rallying cry of headmen of the new global village, headquartered in the shining offices of the World Trade Organization. That was how colonialism stepped onto our shores. We all remember the East India Company. This time around, the colonizer doesn't even need a token white presence in the colonies. The CEOs and their men don't need to go to the trouble of tramping through the tropics, risking malaria, diarrhea, sunstroke, and an early death. They don't have to maintain an army or a police force or worry about insurrections and mutinies. They can have their colonies and their clear consciences. Creating a good investment climate is the new euphemism for third world repression. It's entirely the responsibility of the local administration. In India, in order to clear the way for development projects, the government is in the process of amending the present Land Acquisition Act, which ironically was drafted by the British in the 19th century, and making it more draconian than it already is. State governments are preparing to ratify anti-terrorist laws in which those who oppose development projects are included in the definition of terrorist. They can be held without trial for 3 years. They can have their lands and cattle seized. Recently, globalization has come in for some criticism. What happened in Seattle will go down in history. Each time the WTO or the World Economic Forum wants to meet, they have to barricade themselves with thousands of heavily armed police. But still, all its admirers, from Bill Clinton to A.B. Vajpayee, to the cheering brokers in the stalls, all of them continue to say the same lofty things. If we have the right institutions of governance in place, effective courts, good laws, honest politicians, participative democracy, a transparent administration that respects human rights and gives people a say in decisions that affect their lives, then the globalization project will work for the poor as well. They call this globalization with a human face. The point is that if all this was in place, almost anything would succeed. Socialism, capitalism, you name it. Everything works in paradise, a communist state as well as a military dictatorship. But in an imperfect world, is it globalization that's going to bring us all this bounty? Is that what's happening in India now that it's on the fast track to the free market? Does any one thing on that lofty list apply to life in India today? Are state institutions transparent? Have people had a say? Have they even been informed, let alone consulted about decisions that vitally affect their lives? And are Mr. Clinton, or now Mr. Bush, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, doing everything in their power to see that the right institutions of governance are in place? Or are they involved in exactly the opposite enterprise? Do they mean something else altogether when they talk about the right institutions of governance? On the 18th of October, 2000, in one of the most extraordinary legal decisions in independent India, the Supreme Court permitted the construction of the Sardar Sarovar Dam on the Narmada River to proceed. The court did this despite indisputable evidence placed before it that the project did not have the mandatory environmental clearance from the central government, despite the fact that no comprehensive studies had ever been done on the social and ecological impact of the dam, despite the fact that in the last 15 years, not one single village had been resettled according to the project's own guidelines, despite the fact that they knew that there was no possibility of rehabilitating the 400,000 people that would be displaced by this project. In effect, the Supreme Court of India virtually endorsed the violation of Indian citizens' right to life and livelihood. Big dams in India have displaced not hundreds, not thousands, but millions of people. More than 30 million people in the last 50 years. 60% of them are Dalits and Adivasis. Dalits, if you don't know, are the untouchable castes. Adivasis are indigenous people. Yet India is the only country in the world that refused the World Commission on Dams permission to hold a public hearing in India. The Gujarat government threatened the members of the commission with arrest. And just before I left, just 2 days before I left, the Indian government formally rejected the report of the World Commission on Dams. Does this sound like a transparent, accountable, participative democracy? Recently, the Supreme Court of India ordered the closure of 77,000 polluting and non-conforming industrial units in Delhi. The order will put 2.5 million people out of work. What are these industrial units? Who are these people? They are the millions who've migrated from their villages, some voluntarily, some involuntarily, to Delhi in search of work. They are the people who aren't supposed to exist, the non-citizens who survive in the folds and wrinkles, the cracks and fissures of the official city. They exist just outside the net of official urban infrastructure. Close to 40% of Delhi's population of 12 million, about 5 million people, live in slums and unauthorized colonies. Most of them are not serviced by municipal services. No electricity, no water, no sewage. About 50,000 people are homeless and sleep on the streets. The non-citizens in all third world cities are employed in what economists rather stuffily call the informal sector. The fragile but vibrant parallel economy that both shocks and delights the imagination. They are people who subvert the system. One of my favorite stories is of a man who's now almost a millionaire in Bombay. He started out by insuring ticketless travel. You could go to him, and instead of buying a railway pass that cost 300 rupees a month, you paid him 75 rupees, and he would insure your ticketless travel. If you were caught, he would pay your fine. So he just subverted the whole system. Anyway. So who are the informal sector? They are people who work as hawkers, rickshaw pullers, garbage recyclers, car battery rechargers, street tailors, transistor knob makers, buttonhole stitchers, paper bag makers, dyers, printers, street barbers. These are the industrial units that have been targeted by the Supreme Court. Fortunately, I haven't had that knock on my door yet, though I'm as non-conforming a unit as the rest of them. The trains that leave Delhi these days carry thousands of people who simply cannot survive in the city. They're returning to the villages that they fled in the first place. Millions of others, because they are illegal now, have become easy meat for rapacious, bribe-seeking police and suddenly efficient, predatory government officers. They haven't yet been driven out of the city, but now must live in perpetual fear and anticipation of that happening. In India, the times are full of talk of the free market, of reforms, deregulation, and the dismantling of what in India is called the license Raj, all in the name of encouraging entrepreneurship and discouraging corruption. Yet, when the state, supported by the judiciary, curbs freedom and obliterates a flourishing market, when it breaks the backs of 2.5 million resourceful small-scale entrepreneurs and delivers millions of others as fodder to the doorstep of the corruption industry, few comment on the irony. No doubt it's true that the informal sector is polluting, and according to a colonial understanding of urban land use, it is non-conforming. But then we don't live in a clean, perfect world. What about the fact that 67% of Delhi's pollution comes from motor vehicles? Is it conceivable that the Supreme Court will come up with a car sealing act? The courts and governments have shown no great enthusiasm for closing down big factories run by major industrialists that have polluted rivers, denuded forests, depleted and poisoned groundwater, and destroyed the livelihood of hundreds of thousands of people who live on these resources for a living. This is our in-house version of first world bullying in the global warming debate. We pollute, you pay. But the fishbowl of the globalization project, its truly star turn, is the story of the Houston-based US natural gas company, Enron, and its adventures in India. I don't know how familiar you are with Enron, but it is the most astounding story. I'll tell it to you. The Enron project is the first, most high-profile, fast-track, multinational power project in India. It's the biggest contract ever signed in the history of India. The story has bit parts for everybody from George Bush Jr. downwards. What's happening to the power sector in California is child's play compared to this. In 1993, Enron signed the first power purchase agreement with the state government of Maharashtra for a 695 megawatt power plant. Enron made no secret of the fact that in order to secure the deal, it had paid out $20 million to educate, this is what they call it, educate politicians and bureaucrats involved in the deal. The Hindu right-wing opposition parties, the BJP and the Shiv Sena, set up a howl of nationalist protest and filed legal proceedings in the Bombay High Court against Enron and the Congress-ruled state of Maharashtra. They alleged malfeasance and corruption at the highest level. A year later, when the state elections were announced, this was the only campaign issue of the opposition parties. In February 1995, the Shiv Sena and the BJP won the elections. True to their word, they scrapped the project. The US government began to lean on the Maharashtra government. The US ambassador, who was at the time a man called Frank Wisner, made several public statements condemning this scrapping of this contract. And the day he finished his term as ambassador, he joined Enron as a director. The general gist of the threat was that reneging on the contract would jeopardize the investment climate in India and chase away potential investors. In November 1995, after a legendary meeting between Enron's CEO, the mini-skirted Rebecca Mark, and Bal Thackeray, the malevolent Shiv Sena chief, the government of Maharashtra announced a renegotiation committee. In August 1996, it signed a fresh contract with Enron, counter-guaranteed by the BJP government at the center on terms that would astound the most hard-boiled critic. The impugned contract had involved annual payments to Enron of $430 million for phase 1 of the project. The renegotiated contract made phase 2 mandatory and legally binds the Maharashtra State Electricity Board to pay Enron a sum of $30 billion US. There's no record, of course, of what mathematical formula was used to compute how the costs of re-educating the new government were computed. No trace of how much trickled up or down or sideways, and to whom. In yet another extraordinary decision, in April 1997, the Supreme Court of India refused to entertain an appeal against Enron. Today, 4 years later, everything that critics of the project predicted has come true with an eerie vengeance. The Enron plant produces the most expensive electricity in India. It costs twice as much as its nearest competitor and 7 times as much as the cheapest electricity available in Maharashtra. In May last year, the Maharashtra Electricity Regulatory Committee ruled that until as long as was absolutely necessary, no power should be bought from Enron. It was based on a calculation that it would be cheaper to just pay Enron the mandatory fixed charges for maintenance than to buy the power. The fixed charges alone work out to $220 million US a year for no electricity, just for maintenance. According to the Maharashtra State Electricity Board's calculations from January 2002, even if it pays Enron 90%, even if it buys 90% of Enron's electricity, the losses to the government will amount to $1,200 million US a year. That's more than 60% of India's entire rural development budget. 700 million people live in rural areas, and this one American company mops up all this money. In contravention of the Electricity Regulatory Committee's ruling, the State Electricity Board is cutting back production on its own cheaper units in order to buy electricity from Enron, in order to coerce industrialists to buy this power. Already, 1,400 small industrial units have closed down because they couldn't afford Enron's electricity. In January, the Maharashtra government announced that it didn't have the money to pay Enron's bills. But Enron has enormous political clout. It was one of the biggest contributors to President Bush's election campaign. George Bush Jr. has helped Enron with its global business from as far back as 1988. The current US ambassador, Mr. Richard Celeste, took it upon himself to publicly chastise the Maharashtra chief minister for even considering dishonoring the contract. On the 6th of February, only 10 days after the earthquake in the neighboring state of Gujarat, at a time when the country was still reeling from the disaster, the newspapers reported that Enron had decided to invoke the counter guarantee, and that if the government didn't have the money, it would have to auction the government properties it has named as collateral security in the contract. According to the press, the governor's house and the parliament building could be auctioned away. Nobody knows which buildings are listed in the contract. For now, the secret is safe with Rebecca Mark, who has left Enron and is rumored to have disappeared from the face of corporate America, for a price, of course. Now that the trade barriers are down, I wonder if the Indian people could place an import order. In the interests of transparency and accountability, we would like to requisition one Rebecca Mark and one Warren Anderson. He was the former CEO of Union Carbide, the company that was responsible for the gas leak in Bhopal in 1984 that killed 16,000 people and maimed hundreds of thousands. He's still hiding after all these years here in your country. We would like him back. And relentlessly. It's globalization's pilot project, so it's page one news. In India, for most people, the story of Enron is the story of the globalization project. The final outcome, whatever it's going to be, will have serious lessons in it for everybody. Yet none of the votaries of globalization with the human face have sought to intervene or offer an opinion. Not Clinton, not Bush, not Vajpayee. None of them have come out and said, this is not the kind of investment climate that the globalization project is looking for. Why not? Why are they keeping so quiet? Could it be because it's exactly the kind of investment climate that is sought to be created? It suits first world corporate interests and third world politicians just fine. There are plenty of Enrons on the anvil. As we speak, the whole state of Andhra Pradesh in India is convulsed with protests against the privatization of its power sector. 3 months ago, 5 people were shot by the police during a public demonstration. The fact is that all of India is being ready to be signed away in a sweetheart deal. It's up for sale. It's under the hammer. In circumstances like these, the term writer-activist as a professional description of what I do makes me flinch doubly. First, because it's strategically positioned to diminish both writers and activists. It seeks to reduce the scope, the range, the sweep of what a writer is and can be. It suggests somehow that the writer, by definition, is too effete a being to come up with the clarity, the explicitness, the reasoning, the passion, the grit, the audacity, and if necessary, the vulgarity to publicly take a political position. And conversely, it suggests that the activist occupies the coarser, cruder end of the intellectual spectrum. That the activist is, by profession, a position taker, and therefore lacks complexity and intellectual sophistication, and is instead fueled by a crude, simple-minded, one-sided understanding of things. But the more fundamental problem I have with the term is that professionalizing the whole business of protest, putting a label on it, has the effect of containing the problem and suggesting that it's up to the professionals, activists and writer activists, to deal with. But the fact is that what is happening in India today is not a problem. The issues that some of us are raising are not causes. They are huge political and social upheavals that are convulsing the nation. One is not involved by virtue of being a writer or an activist. One is involved because one is a human being. Writing about it just happens to be the most effective thing I can do. I think it's vital to deprofessionalize the public debate on matters that vitally affect the lives of ordinary people. It's time to snatch our futures back from the experts. Time to ask in ordinary language the public question, and to demand in ordinary language the public answer. Frankly, however trenchantly, however angrily, however combatively one puts forward one's case, at the end of the day, I'm only a citizen, one of many, who is demanding public information, asking for a public explanation. I have no axe to grind. I have no professional stakes to protect. I'm prepared to be persuaded. I'm prepared to change my mind. But instead of an argument or an explanation or a disputing of facts, one gets insults, invective, and the expert's anthem. You don't understand, and it's too complicated to explain. The subtext, of course, is don't worry your little head about it. Go and play with your toys. Leave the real world to us. It's the old Brahmanical instinct. Colonize knowledge, build four walls around it, and use it to your advantage. It would be interesting as an exercise, actually, to find out how many experts, scholars, professionals, consultants in India are actually Brahmins. When it comes to the appropriation and manipulation of knowledge, India has an impressive history. The Manusmriti, the Vedic Hindu code of conduct, says that if a Dalit, an untouchable, overhears a shloka or any part of a religious or sacred text, he must have molten lead poured into his ear. It isn't a coincidence that while India is poised to take her place at the forefront of the information revolution, 400 million of her citizens are illiterate. However, if you're one of the lucky people with a berth booked on the small convoy, then leaving it to the experts can be a mutually beneficial proposition, both for the expert and for yourself. It's a convenient way of shrugging off your own role in the circuitry, and it creates a huge professional market for all kinds of expertise. There's a whole universe waiting to be explored there, a whole ugly universe, I should say. This is not at all to suggest that all consultants are racketeers or that expertise is unnecessary, but you've heard the saying, there's a lot of money in poverty. There are plenty of ethical questions to be asked of those who make a living off their expertise in poverty and despair. For instance, at what point does a scholar stop being a scholar and become a parasite who feeds off despair and dispossession? Does the source of your funding compromise your scholarship? We all know, after all, that World Bank studies are the most quoted studies in the world. Is the World Bank a dispassionate observer of the global situation? Are the studies it funds entirely devoid of interest? Take, for example, the international dam industry. It's worth $20 billion a year. It's bursting with experts and consultants. Given the number of studies, reports, books, PhDs, grants, loans, consultancies, it's odd, wouldn't you say, that there is no really reliable estimate of how many people have been displaced by big dams in India, that there is no estimate for exactly what the contribution of big dams is to the overall food produce in India, that there has not been a single official audit, a comprehensive, honest, thoughtful post-project evaluation of a big dam to see whether or not it achieved what it set out to achieve, whether or not the costs were justified, or even what the costs actually were. What are the experts up to? But if you manage to ignore the invective, shut out the din of the experts' anthem, and keep your eye on the ball, you'll find that a lot of dubious politics lurks inside the stables of expertise. Probe further, and it all precipitates in a bilious rush of abuse, intimidation, and blind anger, the intellectual equivalent of a police baton charge. The advantage of provoking this kind of an unconstrained, spontaneous rage is that it allows you to get a good look at the instincts of some of these normally ponderous, cautious, supposedly neutral people, the pillars of democracy, judges, planners, academics. it becomes very clear that it's not really a question of experts versus laypersons, or knowledge versus ignorance. It's the pitting of one value system against another, one kind of political instinct against another. It's interesting to watch so many supposedly rational people turn into irrational, instinctive political beings, to see how they find reasons to support their views, and how, if those reasons are argued away, they continue to cling to their views anyway. Perhaps for this reason alone, provocation is important, because in a crisis it helps to clarify who's on which side. A wonderful illustration of this is the Supreme Court's reaction to my essay, The Greater Common Good, which was published in May '99. In July and August, the monsoon waters rose in the Narmada and submerged villages. While villagers stood in their homes for days together in chest-deep water to protest against the dam, while their crops were submerged, and while the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the NBA, the people's movement in the valley, pointed out, citing specific instances that the government had committed perjury by signing false affidavits claiming that resettlement had been carried out when it hadn't. The three-judge bench in the Supreme Court, which included the Chief Justice of India, met over 3 sessions. The only subject they discussed was whether or not the dignity of the court had been undermined. To assist them in their deliberations, they appointed what is called an amicus curiae, a friend of the court, to advise them about whether or not they should initiate criminal proceedings against the NBA and me for contempt of court. The thing to keep in mind is that the NBA was a petitioner, but I was, and hopefully I still am, an independent citizen. The 3-judge bench ranted and raved. They threw my book around. They referred to me only as that woman. I began to think of myself as the hooker that won the booker. On the 15th of October 1999, they issued an elaborate order. Here's an extract. Judicial process and institution cannot be permitted to be scandalized or subjected to contumacious violation in such a blatant manner in which it has been done by her. That's me. Vicious stultification and vulgar debunking cannot be permitted to pollute the stream of justice. We are unhappy at the way in which the leaders of the NBA and Ms. Arundhati Roy have attempted to undermine the dignity of the court. We expected better behavior from them. After giving this matter thoughtful consideration, we are not inclined to initiate contempt proceedings against the petitioners, its leaders, or Arundhati Roy. After the 22nd of July 1999, nothing has come to our notice which may show that Ms. Roy has continued with her objectionable writings insofar as the judiciary is concerned. She may have by now realized her mistake. So I said, what's dissent without a few good insults? But anyway, eventually, as you can see, they let me off, and I continued with my objectionable writings. I hope in the course of this lecture, I've managed to inspire at least some of the students in this audience to embark on careers as vicious stultificators and vulgar debunkers. We could do with a few more of those. On the whole, in India, the prognosis is, to put it mildly, not good. And yet, traveling around the country, one cannot help but marvel at the fantastic range and depth and wisdom of the hundreds of people's resistance movements all over the country. They are being beaten down, but they simply refuse to lie down and die. Their political ideologies and battle strategies span the range. We have the maverick Malayali professor who petitions the president every day against the communalization of history texts. We have Sundarlal Bahugana, who risks his life on an indefinite hunger strike protesting the Tehri Dam. The Adivasis in Jadugoda protesting uranium mining on their lands. The Koel Karo Sangathan resisting a mega dam project in Jharkhand. The awe-inspiring Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha. The relentlessly dogged Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan fighting for the right to information. The Beej Bachao Andolan in Tehri Garhwal fighting to save biodiversity of seeds. We have 4,000 different kinds of rice in India. And of course, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the extraordinary people's movement in the Narmada Valley. India's redemption lies in the inherent anarchy and factiousness of its people, and in the legendary inefficiency of the Indian state. Even our heel-clicking, boot-stamping Hindu fascists are indisciplined to the point of being chaotic. They can't bring themselves to agree with each other for more than 5 minutes at a time. Corporatizing India is like trying to impose an iron grid on an heaving ocean and forcing it to behave. My guess is that eventually, India will not behave. It cannot. It's too old and too clever to be made to jump through the hoops all over again. It's too diverse, too grand, too ferine, and eventually, I hope to God, too democratic to be lobotomized into believing in one single idea, which is eventually what globalization really is. Life is profit. Profit for a Naga sadhu who wants to tow the commissioner's car with his penis? I don't think so. Anyway, what is happening to the world lies at the moment just outside the realm of common human understanding. It is the writers, the poets, the artists, the singers, the filmmakers who can make the connections, who can find ways of bringing it into the realm of common understanding, who can translate cash flow charts and scintillating boardroom speeches into real stories about real people with real lives. Stories about what it's like to lose your home, your land, your job, your dignity, your past, and your future to an invisible force, to something you can't see, you can't hate, you can't even imagine. It's a new space that's being offered to us today, a new kind of challenge, and it offers opportunities for a new kind of art. An art which can make the impalpable palpable, make the intangible tangible, and the invisible visible. An art which can draw out the incorporeal adversary and make it real, bring it to book. Cynics say that real life is a choice between the failed revolution and the shabby deal. I don't know, maybe they're right, but even they should know that there's no limit to just how shabby that shabby deal can be. What we need to search for and find, what we need to hone and perfect into a magnificent, shining thing is a new kind of politics. Not the politics of governance, but the politics of resistance, the politics of opposition, the politics of forcing accountability, the politics of slowing things down, the politics of joining hands across the world and preventing certain destruction. In the present circumstances, I'd say that the only thing worth globalizing is dissent. It's India's best export. Thank you.